Longtime journalist Steve Krakauer is right now the executive producer of the wonderful Megyn Kelly Show, but he is also the author of a brand new bestseller, Uncovered, which I have here in my hand, How the Media Got Cozy with Power, Abandoned the Principles, and Lost the People. Steve, welcome to the Hugh Hewitt Show. It's great to have you on.
Hugh, great to speak with you. Thanks for having me on.
I just tweeted out the link, and I've been tweeting out various excerpts of the book as I read it, and I
I
find it's
appreciate that.
really different from the usual standard beat up on the media stuff that we get from the conservative media. And I've written one of those books myself like 20 years ago, and it's an old tune unless you play some new notes. And you play some new notes by doing these deep dive interviews that are largely reproduced intact. How is the reaction to the book among your media colleagues, Steve?
I've been pleasantly surprised, I have to say. I think, yes, as you mentioned, when I set out to write this book, and I've been covering the media off and on really for a dozen or so years. I started as a media reporter, but more recently, I've been very critical of the press through a newsletter that I write called Fourth Watch. But when I set to do the book, I wanted to really do a deep dive, as you mentioned, and I'm always critical of the press. People who write books or people who just write articles, and everyone is behind the anonymous veil, right? And everyone is just a TV insider dishing dirt on someone. So every person I talked to, and it did take a lot of convincing, 26 people on the record, people from Fox News, people from the New York Times, MSNBC, and beyond, who really put their own self on the line. I mean, today's day and age, it does take a level of bravery to put your name to things, especially when you're being critical of your own colleagues in the press. So I'm glad to see that the reaction has been good as well. I think that I'm hoping it starts a conversation. I don't have all the answers, but I do think we need the press to get better. We need a strong press. But at the same time, if the press doesn't listen, if the press doesn't adjust to some of the ideas that I have, I'd rather the public understand what happened, the truth about what really happened over these last 5 to 7 years. So at the very least, we can all get on the same page together as a country.
Uncovered covers new ground, and it does so. There's only one anonymous source that I recall from the book, Steve, which is the NBC News executive who wants to blast Fox and won't go on the record with you to do so. I think you only quoted one anonymous source. I've got to tell you, getting Bob Lay to talk to you this way, getting all these people to talk to you, Tucker, it's not going to help them in the Dominion News case. I was talking with Chris Christie earlier today about the Dominion News case. You obviously went to press before that happened. Does it change your opinion of anything since those text messages came out?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I think that it's an interesting story. I think anytime you can read the text messages of people in power, it gets juicy. And so I think what's interesting about the Dominion case is that, frankly, in the original filing, 400 pages by Dominion, 200 or so pages were Lou Dobbs tweets and Instagram posts and Facebook posts. Lou Dobbs, more than perhaps anyone, was the driving force of the Dominion lawsuit and of the Kraken from Sidney Powell. And Lou Dobbs was the guy who was fired immediately after the lawsuit was put out. So I think that's an interesting note. But I think it does also reveal that it was a really perilous time in November 2020. And I don't get too much into that in the book, but I do think that there was a real moment I wrote about in my newsletter. I kind of described this like blood in the water, where Trump is spinning these lies, and we see in the text messages people like Tucker talking about the fact that Trump is spewing this and is hurting the people that are both fans of Trump and fans of Fox News. And they had a real caring for the people. And yes, they have to kind of wade gently into this conversation because you don't want to alienate your audience, but you also don't want to spin them lies either. And so the text messages we saw, that's kind of the direction. The Lou Dobbs and the Kraken and those, that was a different pile of what happened there. And that, I think, was unfortunate because I think that, yes, the audience was spun a lie that ultimately, we learned about, but it wasn't really necessarily from the Tuckers of the world and the Sean Hannity and the Laura Ingrams.
And the trouble that we have in the media, which is articulated best on page 51 of Uncovered with your four square box. I tweeted it. I love four square boxes because it's a great way to organize thinking. Ideas are either presented as acceptable or unacceptable, and they are either presented with a correct or an incorrect angle. And that really does provide the four square box. Have other people seized on that as the right lens through which to view every story?
I have spoken to that with a couple people. I think, yes, I described it as Pascal's wager of woke journalism. Pascal's wager is a very old philosophical term that relates to the belief in God. The wager is it's better to believe in God than not because it's just the odds are better that you might as well do it because the belief in God is better to go that direction. So But with journalism, it used to be correct and incorrect. Those were really the only metrics that mattered. And I mean, used to like 10, 15, 20 years ago. But now we have this new layer, this new axis of, acceptable versus unacceptable. And we see this in story after story. You can cover a story in a correct way. You can be accurate. But if you are deemed unacceptable by the people on Twitter, by the loudest voices, by the activists, even the activists within the media these days, then you get this backlash, and then it gets you to say, well, why would I do it anyway? Why I might as well just cover the story in the acceptable way, take my chances that it'll turn out true. If it doesn't turn out true, we'll just move on to the next thing. Everything moves so fast, and that's really a hit to the public, because story after story, Jussie Smollett, the lab leak. I mean, we could go right down the line.
Jeffrey Epstein.
Laptop story. Yes, Jeffrey Epstein, which I write about in chapter 7. All of these, it's like, just take the easy way out rather than do the hard work and get the story right originally, because the backlash from, the cultural backlash is too hard for you as a media organization these days.
In Uncovered, you've got the receipts on Twitter. 80% of tweets come from 3% of the users. It's D plus 48%. And the reveal for me is that editors live in fear of Twitter, which I just think is absurd, right? It's just absurd that editors care about what the bubble thinks, because they're not selling to the bubble. They're selling to the public if they're doing a good job. So I thought that was fascinating. But let me go to my confirmation bias, my favorite part of the book. You cite a lot of problems: geographic bias. You talk about lack of introspection, coziness with power. My favorite part is the laziness and incompetence versus conspiracy theory. And I want to illustrate it this way. How many interviews have you done thus far about Uncovered?
Oh, probably, 20, 25 or so. Yeah.
Of the 20 to 25, how many people have read the book?
There have been definitely a couple. I will say it's very clear there's been a couple, but no, certainly not a very large portion, I would say.
I put this down to laziness and incompetence. Why have an author on unless you're willing to read the book and engage with the text and come prepared to ask questions, and to read about Eric Wemple talking about this thing, or the darkness at noon, the guilt and the purges. I just don't think news people are very curious anymore. They've lost that. Yeah. I'm not going to go talk to Steve Krakauer unless I've read Uncovered, because that will be a terrible conversation. Don't you find that frustrating?
I do, and I have to say, I really do appreciate you tweeting out your live tweeting your reading of it over the weekend and this week. I really do appreciate that. No, I think it's great. I really. The lack of curiosity. I mean, I talk about incompetence and laziness; those are bad. But journalists of all occupations should be the most curious people. And I would actually go a step further. I think they should be nosy. I think you should be almost disliked. You should be like a gnat. You should be annoying to the people in power. And yet, so often now it's the opposite. And for a lot of factors, I think Twitter is one of them. The incentive structure of Twitter is you want to be liked, you want to get more followers and more likes, and that can lead to contracts and book deals. And so I get that there's this push-pull right now, but the job of a journalist is to be curious. The job of a journalist is to be the most curious person in the room and want to find out every secret and every detail, to the detriment of your own sort of personal standing, your social standing. The cozier with power that journalists get, that live in New York and DC almost entirely when it comes to these corporate media jobs, that's a real problem. And it honestly took me moving to Dallas and moving outside of it. And frankly, stepping back over these last couple of years and writing this to kind of try to see the big picture and say, what really went wrong? Because something serious went wrong over the last few years that was not there, even though there was valid criticism of the press from, for decades. Something major changed in the last few years.
Well, what changed, and I think you articulated, is the cell of media became much more insular than it has ever been. Now, I spent half my year outside of the Beltway and half my year inside of the Beltway, but prior to 2016, I lived in California from 89 to 2016. I always thought I had a different take on the news because I didn't have this suffocating need to please. And nobody wants to fight with their coworkers all the time. But a radio studio, as you've discovered, you work with a very smart person. Megyn Kelly is very smart, very well trained. She doesn't have to worry about anybody else's opinion of her because she made her bones and she knows what she's doing, and you're doing that too. But that's not the case in the Beltway or along the Acela media. They have to worry every day that they're going to get thrown out, purged. Ratings aren't good. So they go for, I think the two models are, do you want 5% of the 100%? That's the Hewitt model. I want 5% of everyone in the United States to listen to the radio show. Or do you want 100% of the 0.5%? Other people follow that model. That model is destructive. You monetize eccentricity. Do you see it changing, Steve Krakauer? Because Uncovered doesn't leave me very optimistic.
No, and I do try in the last chapter to lay out some potential solutions.
Unions!
From the media reads it and listens.
Well,
Unions! Look, the union comment is really about the idea that, look, the general staffer in these newsrooms are not going to listen to their bosses. That ship has sailed. Will they listen to their colleagues? Potentially, and that's one avenue of doing it. I don't have high hopes. Frankly, I think the corporate press, along with really the elite establishment in this country today, it has so much disdain for the average American and just wants to divide us in sort of warring tribes. They kind of benefit by that. And from a media perspective, they benefit from that because that's where their viewers are. That's where the lowest hanging fruit is. Just grab onto the ones that you know are the closest to you because the business model is changing. Just try to just grasp on as we hold on for dear life. That's a problem, and that doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. I think that what we need is a country that is united in a way that doesn't need the establishment gatekeepers. And I do hope that by laying all the cards on the table, by saying, here's the truth about these stories that we saw, Hunter Biden, Jeffrey Epstein, lab leak, COVID, all of these stories of the last few years, let's get on the same page together, because then we really don't need them. We can go to independent press. We can go to places that we trust.
Let me go to the ESPN discussion you had with Bob Lay. Because it's just, I used to watch SportsCenter, and then I just got tired of politics. I'm a sports guy. I want to read about the Browns, the Tribe, the Guardians. I want to read about the Cavaliers and the Ohio State Buckeyes. I do not need politics on ESPN. Bob Lay, longtime ESPN contributor, you interviewed him. He did his own deep dive into individual contributions made by ESPN staff members. 82%, not of the total money, but of the number of contributions, 82% went to Democrats, 18% went to Republicans. That would be, it's higher in regular newsrooms, by the way, if they're allowed to contribute. Right. But I'm asked it, when did sports journalism become political?
And that's what's so interesting about it. And I do really appreciate Bob, who's a sports journalist, Hall of Famer, and Outside the Lines host, really speaking so candidly about this, giving what happened internally at these meetings during his last few years there over the last couple of years. I think that the truth is that the general person who goes to ESPN, probably just like the rest of the media who ends up in the Northeast and DC and New York, and in ESPN's case in Connecticut, leans left and largely will contribute to Democrats. But then the guardrails came off after Donald Trump got elected. Then all of a sudden it was okay to speak freely, and the bosses that would hold strong, suspend people for tweeting their political perspective or to weighing in completely non-sports ways, in total ideological ways. They would clamp down on that. Well, suddenly they didn't anymore. Why? Because of the cultural incentives changed, because the business model was slipping, and there's real fear. There was panic. And in that panic, in that void, all of these bad mistakes get made and all of these bad decisions get made. And it starts going down this line of alienating large portions of your base. So yeah, I spent a lot of time in Chapter 9 on ESPN because yes, I think it's, sort of a little bit outside of the more corporate media structure, but it is really telling. It's just another case study like the New York Times or CNN and others, where we've seen this slip, and trying to document why this happened, how this happened, is really important for the audience to understand what we're facing.
I would be wrong if I got out of this without talking about the Trump addiction, because you detail what happened when Jeff Zucker, and I like Jeff, and I like everyone at CNN. I think Chris Licht is going to do a good job turning it around and bringing it back to the center. But everybody got addicted to Trump. And I still say he's the best interview in America because people listen and he always makes news because he says whatever is top of mind. Best interview in America. I will never not agree with that.
You did some great ones with him, yeah.
Well, he's just you just have to get out of the way. It's not really an art with Donald Trump. Just ask him good questions. But the Trump addiction endures, Steve. Is it ever going to end prior to his departure for higher realms?
I can't imagine it does. Potentially, the only way it does is if the business isn't there, right? I think there are three reasons that I lay out in the book, broadly for why we got the Trump addiction that we saw that was just so disastrous for the media, so catastrophic, that eroded trust. One of them was business. I mean, he was just so good for business, as you mentioned. I mean, people would watch and people would click. Exactly, right. So that's great, and if he maintains that, then we're going to see that again for sure over these next couple of years. It was personal though, also. I mean, Jeff Zucker obviously made Trump, and Trump made Jeff Zucker at NBC with the Celebrity Apprentice. I mean, this is what's so funny. In 2005, not very long ago, Gayle King and Jeff Zucker and Katie Couric, they were all at his wedding. I mean, he was in that world and he became this turncoat, so it became personal as well. But then you have these people that I believe they are still in these newsrooms and to this day believe this. I interviewed with Brian Stelter last week and had a kind of a nice back and forth. I believe he believes that he was in an existential fight with a person in power to save democracy. And that's what the press largely believed they were doing. And I think that that's completely ridiculous. I think that that's wrong. But if you believe
it's so absurd.
At the very least,
it's so absurd.
It is absurd. Yes. But if you believe that, that's when you need to double down on your standards. That's when you actually have to dig in and say, okay, we need to convince the audience of this. So we need to hold strong to our journalistic principles. They went the opposite direction. They said, to meet this threat, we must abandon our principles and instead, go and just tell the truth, or, as they would say. That's a big problem. And I don't see that subsiding. I really do not. I think we see that. I think that the Trump addiction is what we saw with the January 6th coverage. It's what we continue to see with, frankly, the way that the bizarre way that the lab leak theory is still being talked about in the press. Why? Because Trump pushed it. And there's just this hangover effect that they can't get rid of.
All right, let's conclude, Steve, by talking about looking forward to the media. Everybody now is part of a cult. And the cult in the newsroom is to hate Trump and view him as an existential threat to democracy, which I tell you, even if Pence had been persuaded and put aside the electoral votes, and that would have been wrong, and Pence did the right thing, in my view, that the Supreme Court would have ordered them counted in about a day. There was never going to be a coup. There was no threat to democracy. The riot was a bad thing. They're all being prosecuted. But this cult of anti-Trumpism, it broke people. I mean, it just absolutely destroyed their ability to see. You write about one of the problems is there is a lack of introspection in the media. Will they develop that introspection about Trump, or will this forever be a blank zone in their memory where they kind of lost consciousness for 10 years?
I think really, Hugh, it depends on how not only do they think about Trump, but how do they think about the country? Because what I write about, Selena Zito is someone who I have great respect for, and she's very candid in the book that she essentially got hired by Jeff Zucker because in that November 2016, when they were shocked about the Trump election, they believed they missed something. And Selena was someone who saw what was coming. And so they brought her in. She tells me that she spoke in front of the whole newsroom and was interviewed there. And there was a few weeks there where they really were saying, let's get Selena on the air. Let's get her perspective. And then that changed. And then suddenly it's like, why would they believe these lies? She's like, I don't know. I'm just reporting what they believe. And then she was sidelined for years. The entire length of her CNN contract from 2018 on to 2020, she was completely off the air. So I think that what happened was not only did they turn against Trump and his administration, but the people that put him in office, half this country essentially, they just had this overriding disdain for, and just a total disinterest in learning about these people. And I think that continues to this day, unfortunately.
This is a great place to end. Selena is my weekly guest, my first guest of the week on every Monday. Because she comes from Pittsburgh and we have fun with the Yinzer Report and all that, but she's also outside of the Beltway, outside of this ecosystem that impacts. Selena was banished. There are two kinds of Republicans who show up on television, missionaries and refugees. We're down to the refugees. They're no longer in the Republican Party. They've been forced out. They're on the sidelines. They're on MSNBC. They're banished from CNN. Mary Catherine Ham is another example. I think Licht may change that. But Selena Zito is the perfect case study, as is your colleague, Megyn. We don't see Megyn, and she's clearly one of the most important commentators on the current scene. What has happened there? What is wrong with our editorial product?
Well, I mean, Megyn it's a choice. She's very happy to be on the outside now. We're doing, we love the audience that we built as an independent outlet and through SiriusXM. So that's that answer. But no, I agree with you. Chris Licht, I think the mandate there to insert news back in, even despite ratings shouldn't be the driving factor. We need to establish the trust. I think you need to get back to the place where someone says, I want to turn on the news, and they turn on CNN. That completely lost the ability for CNN to be associated that way during the Zucker era, sadly, because it was so polarized and so partisan and so ideological. So I don't see that happening, but I do think that What Selena gets, and what I hope I get at also, is it's not ideological. There is a real, it doesn't matter. There are people throughout this country who lean left, who are Democrats, who are independents, who don't trust the media, who are not swayed because they don't buy into the nonsense of the yelling at each other, the cable news, punditry, and they don't believe that there is this existential threat happening. They don't believe that. They don't believe that we're even as divided as is being portrayed in the corporate media and the Acela corridor. So I don't think that you get to a better place as a corporate press unless you can get the individuals back into the country to understand the mood and what's actually happening in the average person. Ideology aside, it doesn't matter. What matters is about getting to the truth and getting to treating people with respect from both parties.
Get out of the bubble. If there's anything that Steve Krakauer has done in Uncovered, and he's done a lot of good stuff in Uncovered, it's get out of the bubble. And I am very appreciative of your work here, Steve. I'm sure it's going to be a New York Times bestseller. Continued, come back, keep talking to us. And when they offer you that CNN contract, don't say no.
Hugh, thanks so much. I'd love to talk anytime.
Thank you, Steve.